Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Here's a picture of some folks in the early 20th century, last century, over 100 years ago now, sitting around in Westerly watching a shipwreck, which is what people really like to do. And there's a shipwreck around, people will come and watch it. In fact, a few years before that picture was taken, the local Westerly newspaper said, "If the wreck that is currently on our shores lasts the summer, it will draw many visitors to our town." They wanted the shipwrecks as tourist attractions. And why not? So this is my office, the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission. It's a state agency, and we're sort of the bureaucrats of historical preservation. We push lots of pieces of paper around. So I'm an archaeologist there, and as is so often the case, my office is in the basement, which is where they usually put archaeologists. And I was sitting there pushing pieces of paper around, deciding whether things were archaeologically interesting or not, when I got a call from the folks that do the Images of America series, and they said, "Would you like to do a book for us on the shipwrecks of Rhode Island?" And I immediately imagined myself, skipping from historical society to library, picking only the best pictures of Rhode Island shipwrecks. And I said, "Sure, this will be but the work of weeks." And so for the next few months, I was desperately trying to shake loose any pictures of Rhode Island shipwrecks I could find. And it's trickier than one would think, because most shipwrecks very selfishly wrecked at night out at sea with no cameras. And it's just very difficult. But I was able to gather the requisite number of high-quality pictures and brought them together in a book. Now, one of these divers is working in Florida, and one of them is doing underwater archaeology in Rhode Island. Yes. Clearly you've guessed which one it is. And underwater archaeology in Rhode Island is dark, it is cold, and the shipwrecks themselves have a tendency to be somewhat degraded. You aren't going to see anything that looks really like a fish tank sort of shipwreck with its masts still in place and everything. You're going to get, if it's a wooden shipwreck, just a bottom slice of sort of moldy timbers. Anything protected by mud will survive to some extent. So our shipwrecks, our wooden early shipwrecks, are not really the most beautiful things, but there's still lots of interesting stories about them, gathered in my Rhode Island Shipwrecks book. Before the Europeans arrived in Rhode Island, there was a lot of marine traffic on the waters. The Native Americans had dugout canoes that were incredibly seaworthy. They could make voyages back and forth to Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Block Island, and there was a lot of traffic. Probably just about every shoreline had dugout canoes lying there, sort of like those rideshare scooters, and people would take the dugout canoe when they needed it and bring it back next time. And Roger Williams gave us a first-hand account of what it was like to navigate in a dugout canoe. He taught us how to say in the Narragansett language useful expressions like, "We shall be drowned," "We overset," "The sea comes in too fast upon us," "Be of good courage." "It is wonderful how," he commented, "being oft o'erset, as I myself have been among them, they will swim a mile, yea, 2 or more to land." So clearly travel by dugout canoe was not always safe, but unfortunately dugout canoes make really bad shipwrecks because, being essentially logs, they have a lot of floatability and they don't sink. So we have not found any dugout canoes from maritime misfortunes in Rhode Island. However, I hope you in the back can see this picture. Sometimes dugout canoes were preserved for the winter in cold water lakes. They were deliberately sunk with stones in them and put down at the bottom of the lake so that in spring you could haul it up again and it would still be as fresh as when you put it down in the fall. And so this one lake in Massachusetts, had several dugout canoes, and these little lumps are the stones that were used to sink it. And I'm very jealous of Massachusetts for having a type of ship that we don't have. And I hope that someday in one of our lakes here in Rhode Island, someone will find dugout canoes so that we too in Rhode Island can have them. Because most of my work was done on ships that had pictures, I don't have a lot of shipwreck pictures from the 17th century or the 18th century. The first illustrated shipwreck, before I get to that, most of the maritime misfortunes in Rhode Island did not result in actual shipwrecks. The ships were able to be salvaged, to be refloated, to be lifted by the rising tide. However, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, keeps track of shipwrecks as hazards to navigation, and so Rhode Island's waters are liberally dotted with many shipwrecks. There are about 3,000 shipwrecks in Rhode Island, and many more that just met with misfortunes and then went on their way. And so we're only going to be talking about a fraction of them tonight. Starting with the Gatsby, Rhode Island's most historically well-known shipwreck. The Gatsby was a British customs schooner, and in 1772, it was patrolling Narragansett Bay, trying, depending on how you look at it, to take what was due to the Crown of England, or, on the other hand, to persecute the innocent Rhode Island commercial venturers and take their hard-earned money. So, the Gatsby was pursuing the American ship Hannah, and the Hannah was fleeing upward toward Providence and went over a sandbar off of Warwick on a falling tide. The Hannah was smaller than the Gatsby and was able to clear the sandbar, but the larger Gatsby went aground and had to wait for the tide to come back up before it could be free. But while it was stuck on the sandbar, folks from Rhode Island came down and set it on fire. And that is an artist's representation of the Gatsby burning. And many, many people have tried to find the Gatsby. But the problem is that since the tide did rise again, what was left of her burnt carcass floated off, and so some people have speculated that the tide could have taken it away as far as East Providence. And so who's going to find the Gatsby off of East Providence? We'll probably never actually find this particular shipwreck. When the Revolutionary War got going, Newport was the base of British naval operations in the north of the colonies. And their frigates patrolled Narragansett Bay, and their smaller vessels were used to take raiding parties to harass the farms of Narragansett Bay and Block Island and Long Island. When the French joined into the war, the British were very alarmed because their ships of war were smaller, and they were afraid that the French would come in from the sea and pin them in the north of the bay, and that the British ships would be captured. So when faced with the prospect of the French attacking from the sea, the British decided that they would destroy their own ships rather than have them fall into the French hands. And so they ran their ships of war, 4 frigates aground, and blew them up. 3 of them were run aground off the coast of Newport in southern Middletown, and 1 was up in Portsmouth. And the one in Portsmouth actually exploded with such force that a burning timber went a mile inland, they said. We can believe that or not, if we wish. Up at the top is what one of the frigates would have looked like when it was still sailing. And I mentioned moldy wooden timbers before. Those are moldy wooden timbers from an 18th century frigate. That is what they look like today. As well as the frigates, the British scuttled a lot of their little transports. They were afraid that the French would be able to get in close and bombard the defenses of Newport. And so they made sort of a fence of the masts of the little transports to keep the French ships from getting close enough to do that. This is a drawing, whoops, I went too far. This is a drawing from a French engineer after Newport was liberated. And these are all the little transports that were sunk to protect the battery there and the one there. And so they weren't very exciting ships. They were just little workboats, basically, that had had previous lives and then were deliberately scuttled here. And after the Revolutionary War, a lot of salvage was done on them, taking anything that was useful and could be gotten, because they were only in about 30, 40 feet of water. But what makes them especially interesting is not just their history during the Revolutionary War, even though one of them was a prison ship, and several famous Newporters were imprisoned on it by the British, but one of them was the Lord Sandwich ex-Endeavour. This is what they look like now on the bottom of the bay. They have piles of ballast stone. Some of them have exposed timbers, and some of them have cannons. So there's not a lot of exposed ship structure that gives you a real clear idea of how big they were. But one of them was Captain Cook's Endeavour before it became a transport. And we have a very good idea of how big the Endeavour was. We have its whole schematics. And so if we can find enough of the transports buried beneath the silt to give us an idea of their dimensions of the different sites that we have, we'll be able to say with pretty good certainty, this particular pile of ballast and moldy wood is the Endeavour. And that will be exciting. And the Australian National Maritime Museum is currently funding the work of the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project because of their interest in the Endeavour. The Endeavour is to Australia basically what the Mayflower would be to New England. I myself am from Virginia, so the Mayflower means nothing to me, so Australian divers have come over to work with the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project, which is a nonprofit organization headquartered here at the Herrschaft in one of the buildings that way. And they've been working on these sites for almost 2 decades now, almost 20 years, trying to figure out which one is the Endeavour. And we're pretty close to being able to say it is that one. That's exciting. So visit the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project website, and you'll be able to read all about the Endeavour. So the next shipwreck I have to offer is another military shipwreck. Before Oliver Hazard Perry became famous for his 1813 victory against the British in Lake Erie, that's the whole don't give up the ship business, which has nothing to do with Rhode Island, so we'll pass over quickly. He patrolled local waters as the commander of the schooner Revenge. In January of 1811, unfortunately, he was on the Revenge and it ran aground on a reef off of Watch Hill while attempting to navigate the hazardous water. It just went badly for him, as it does for so many of us. And the Revenge was stuck on the reef, and they lightened it as best they could, throwing the cannons overboard and anything else heavy overboard, but it was pretty badly stuck. And so they abandoned it. And in 2011, 2 local historians and divers found it again. They metal detected what looked like just regular ocean debris, and they found the cannons. Now, the Revenge was a naval vessel, and when a naval vessel sinks, it remains the property of the Navy forever and ever and ever. So the Navy has its own cultural resource center down in Washington, and they sent their own divers up to look at it. And they retrieved one of the cannon, and they took it down to Washington to conserve it and look at it. And although it doesn't say, "I belong to the Revenge" on it, it does appear to support the idea that this was that particular ship. And so that's a nice one for us to have here in Rhode Island. Even though, again, there's not anything to see actually under the water. But okay. This is the one Bristol shipwreck I have in my shipwreck book. The Bristol shipwrecks, there were more than just one, but this is the only one that got photographed. The Bay State Steamboat Company began offering steamboat service between New York City up into the Narragansett Bay to Fall River in 1847, and other companies, like the Fall River Line, soon followed. With the development of steam power came the risks of fires and explosions to add to your basic strandings and sinkings. You could now burn, too. And so there's quite a lot of steamships burning in my book. One of the first to catch fire was Bristol's own Empire State, launched in 1848. She was destroyed by fire in May of 1887 at her winter mooring in Bristol. We don't know what caused this particular fire, but it was so fierce that one of the caretakers on board was scorched trying to get out of the thing. And she sank in the harbor with only her smokestacks and walking beam and flagstaffs visible above the water. And if you ever feel like diving in Bristol Harbor, you can find some of her old machinery that wasn't ever salvaged still down there. But you have to be careful that you don't get run over by boat traffic. And this, although it's not a Bristol vessel, this is the Bristol. And she began her career as a passenger steamboat in 1867. And she worked for the Fall River Line for the next 27 years with a somewhat checkered safety record. She sank 2 other vessels in collisions. So she was not a nice one. And she herself ran ashore several times, but was refloated. On December 29th in 1888, fate caught up with her, and she left New York on what was to be her final voyage, and she arrived at Newport in the early morning of December 30th, and her crew began to cook breakfast. Unfortunately, a saucepan of fat caught fire, and by 6 a.m., the flames had broken through the ship's upper deck, and she burned. And that was all that was left of her after the fire. So be careful when you cook on board your steamship. But it's not just steamships that catch fire. Also be careful if you're carrying a cargo of lime. In 1872, the Abbey Dun was carrying a cargo of lime to Newport and sprang a leak in a storm. Wet lime spontaneously combusts, so it's perhaps the least appealing cargo to be carrying in your leaky wooden vessel. The Abbey Dun was breached in the shallows off Kings Park at Newport and left to decay. And she basically sat there and rotted away, not salvageable. Okay, so we looked at steamships briefly, but there were, of course, many wooden vessels sailing in use into the 20th century, and they had lots of chances for misfortunes, too. In November of 1887, the 3-masted schooner Maggie J Smith set off from New York on her final voyage with a cargo of coal bound for New Hampshire. In rough seas kicked up by a southwest gale, she hit a reef running off from Bass Rock 2 miles to the south of Narragansett Pier Life-Saving Station. The captain apparently mistook a light on the coast of Narragansett for the Beavertail Lighthouse, and so he went to the west to avoid what he thought was the Beavertail Lighthouse, but was not able to get around all of Narragansett successfully, and in fact, hit it. So there he was, stuck off of Narragansett, and ended up on the rocks about 100 yards from the shore. The Maggie J Smith was a sailing vessel, but had an auxiliary steam engine, which was not uncommon, and so they were able to use their steam engine to sound loud whistles of distress, which were heard by folks on shore. The crew were rescued, and according to a newspaper account, they were all given stimulating drinks, which perhaps the captain had already had too many of. The surfmen boarded the vessel the next day to retrieve their gear and also recovered the personal effects of the crew, but the Maggie J Smith could not be saved, and her wooden hull was eventually picked up by the waves and tossed ashore, and that's how she ended up. This is my personal favorite shipwreck story. This is the schooner Eva L Leonard, aground off Castle Hill, Newport. If you're familiar with Castle Hill, you'll maybe be wondering what the house is in the back. That's Bleak House. It was a mansion built in the 19th century, but demolished in the 1940s, so it's no longer there, which is why you might not be able to place it. So anyway, the Eva Leonard was traveling through a brief but intense snowstorm in January of 1895, and the captain lost his bearings. And they went whack onto the rocks. But So there they were. It was January. It was snowing. It was night. Obviously, they're close to shore. They could have swum, but then they would have been on shore soaking wet in a snowstorm in January, and that wouldn't have really worked out well for them. So they huddled together on their boat, wondering what on earth was going to become of them as their ship was lashed by waves. Fortunately, a burglar alarm, which proved to be false in the end, had been sounded for one of the big mansions up on Newport, and so the local police force had been called out to wander through the snowstorm looking for burglars. And instead of burglars, they saw this poor vessel in distress and were able to go get the life-saving crew, who were able to bring through the snowstorm, pushing it a mile, their cart with their life-saving gear, which they had never had a chance to use before, so it was nice for them that they, that they got to practice. And so they got there, and it was still pitch black and snowing, and they took many calls to the ship to get the people on the Eva Leonard to come back above deck so they could cooperate with being saved, but in the end they were. And everyone was got off safely, thanks to the false burglar alarm. Okay, this is not a funny story. This is the Larchmont. The Larchmont is one of Rhode Island's most famous disasters and tragedies. So when steam meets sail, all of you know that steam is supposed to yield the right of way, but this doesn't really work out well in practice historically. And that's what happened with the Larchmont. The Larchmont is steam in this story, a passenger steamship traveling between Providence and New York. In February of 1907, a routine trip turned into disaster when the Larchmont was struck by the Harry Knowlton, a three-masted coal schooner. And the Harry Knowlton didn't just clip the Larchmont, it banged right into her and severed her main steam line. And so immediately below decks was filled with scalding steam, and anyone that couldn't get out fast enough was scalded to death before the ship even sank. There were 20-foot waves that were quickly covering anyone that did make it out to the deck in ice. And so the captain ordered lifeboats launched, and within 15 minutes of the collision, the Larchmont had sunk. The surfmen in Westerly tried to get there as fast as they could, launching their boats into the frozen waves, but they weren't able to get out to the Larchmont fast enough to be much help. And the hurricane deck of the Larchmont served as a raft for 16 or so people on board. They were able to cling to it when it got washed off the ship. But that was pretty hellish for them too, because every time a wave washed over the hurricane deck, there would be fewer of them left clinging to it. And so only 5 of the people that were using it as a raft made it to shore. The survivors were picked up, actually not to shore, they were picked up by a passing schooner. And the deck itself washed up on Block Island. Of the approximately 150 passengers and crew on board, only 12 survived. In the following days, the frozen bodies of the victims washed up on the shore of Block Island. And that was the job of the Block Islanders, was to gather the frozen dead. The caption of the postcard at the bottom says that the people in the cart are survivors, but I feel that they don't actually look like they survived. No, so it was a sad and awful time for Block Island. Some of the people were even frozen in sort of desperate swimming positions, and it was just terrible. The crew of the Henry Knowlton were more fortunate. They were able to keep their momentum enough to go aground just off Westerly. And you can see that part of the Larchmont is still stuck in the Harry Knowlton's bow. So they were all gotten off by the life-saving crew, and the cargo of coal that she was carrying was salvaged. And the Henry Knowlton just broke apart in the surf the rest of that winter. And so there was another similar tragedy, but the Larchmont has it beat because of the winter weather and the horror of the whole loss of life. This is a fairly generic Rhode Island shipwreck. This is your typical ship going aground off the south coast of Block Island, which is about the most common way to shipwreck yourself in Rhode Island historically. And it's not even a particularly interesting ship. This is a Navy collier, Nero, in 1906. And she was towed off But the next time the Nero shipwrecked, it was a much more interesting occasion. The next time she shipwrecked herself on the rocks, it was off the coast of Newport on Brenton's Reef, and the tugs were not able to pull her free. I like this picture very much because you can see little tug, big collier, and it shows you how powerful those tugs must have been to pull those big, to even try to pull something that big off the rocks, although it did fail in this case. But happily for both the Navy and for the Nero, the Navy had just been experimenting with the discoveries of a guy named Arbuckle, who had designed a method of raising vessels using compressed air. So they used the Nero as a test case for this new way to get ships off the rocks. They sealed every gap in the Nero's battered body and were able to fill it with enough compressed air to float it off the rocks, and then take it to the Navy Yard in New York City to be repaired. And there it sort of made naval ship repair history again, because it was one of the first naval vessels repaired using thermite welding, which had just been discovered too, and was a much faster and efficient way of repairing these metal ships. So as a wreck, she was not very interesting, but as a piece of wreck history, she is. And here is another ship shipwrecked off of Block Island. And it's not a great picture because this is the ship and it's kind of the same color as the coast of Block Island. So it's a good story, though, I promise you that. This is the Swift Star. And it was October 1922, and it was foggy, and she went aground on the rocks. The crew at first remained with the ship, and at 6 o'clock the next morning, a tug from New London tried to assist, but was unable to. Conditions quickly got pretty bad on board, with the pumps fouling and the two boilers cutting out. At 10 a.m., the crew realized they'd have to abandon ship by nightfall, and an hour later, the engine room flooded, and the captain decided that he wouldn't wait till nightfall, but would take his best friends from the crew and get off now. And so the captain left the ship with 33 of the crew still on board. And there they were on this ship that was falling apart around them. And fortunately, a passing submarine came by and was able to stop and get everyone off the Swift Star and take them into shore. They were apparently all packed on the submarine like sardines, the newspaper said, but they made it safely. And when the fog lifted, the World Wireless Service reported that the, quote, usual curious natives were gathered at the beach, where the Swift Star could be seen just offshore. So that's what happened to her on the rocks. And there's the tug trying to come get her off. And she was repaired in the end and sailed on her way, and ended up the next year trying to go through the Panama Canal, where she disappeared without a trace. And that's the end of that story. And now for something completely the same, here's another shipwreck that went aground on a shore just off the south coast of Block Island. This is the Spartan. And it's not a particularly interesting shipwreck, but I like the picture of the crew being rescued by means of the breeches buoy. So this was basically a rescue zip line using rubber pants. You would shoot a line to the ship in distress, and they would make it fast, and then you would send the rubber pants back and forth. And the people being rescued would ride in the wooden pants, the rubber pants, to safety. And when the life-saving services were practicing in summer, many tourists would pay for the privilege of going for rides in the rubber rescue pants. So that's what they looked like. It was probably less fun when you were being rescued from a shipwreck off Block Island, but. The Commonwealth was a passenger steamship built in 1908 and nicknamed the Giantess of the Sound because she was very big. And she was the flagship of the Fall River Line. On a foggy morning in 1912, the battleship USS New Hampshire was lying at anchor in Newport Harbor when the Commonwealth left on her next journey. Now, so it's morning in Newport Harbor, and it was probably foggy and a little misty, and battleships are gray. But still, they're big, and so the Commonwealth just didn't see the New Hampshire and went smack into her, 20 feet into her, in fact. That's the captain's cabin, right there of the New Hampshire. Unfortunately, he was an early riser and was not in bed. So when the vessels separated, it appeared that the Commonwealth had sustained little damage, although clearly the New Hampshire has been badly affected. So the Commonwealth is slightly damaged, but the mangling of the New Hampshire did not build public confidence in the Navy's new fleet of armored ships. But on closer inspection, it's pretty clear that the damage to the New Hampshire ends a few inches above the waterline at the armor belt. It's armored from there down, and this part is no longer armored because now that we aren't using cannons for naval warfare anymore, it's what's underwater that needs to be armored and not what's above water. And you can see that that armor has taken the bottom of the Commonwealth off. And you can see that again here. Slice. And so the New Hampshire still was a floating vessel, whereas the Commonwealth had to be taken out of the water immediately or else it would have sunk. So the New Hampshire actually won. So. This is another passenger steamship, and this is another, this one does have loss of life, so I will try not to make it a funny story, but. The steamship Boston was run down by the oil tanker Swift Arrow on the shore of Narragansett in heavy fog in July of 1924. 4 individuals, the unfortunate occupants of these staterooms who were in their beds, were killed when the Swift Arrow crashed through the side of the ship. However, the occupant of one of the inner cabins beyond those 4 woke up to find himself looking up at the red bow of the Swift Arrow in his cabin with him. And then he watched a minute later as it slowly withdrew again. Finding it too difficult to get dressed in his mangled cabin, the passenger decided to go back to bed. It took several hours for the passengers to be evacuated from the Boston into the lifeboats, but 3 young women brought a phonograph album up to the deck and staged an impromptu dance party for everyone that was able to get to the deck and not stay in their mangled cabins. And that improved morale very much. This is another picture of the damage to those 4 staterooms. The submarine S-51, on the bottom right, was launched in 1921, and it was cruising on the surface about 14 miles off Block Island a few years later, at the same time as a merchant steamer, the City of Rome, top left, was traveling the same waters. And unfortunately, the City of Rome and the S-51 played a game of chicken that ended really badly, with the City of Rome slamming into the submarine. And that's what the bow of the City of Rome did to the submarine, and it sank almost instantly, with many of the men still on board. And the City of Rome was not a good citizen and did not stick around to report immediately, and they did not explain that this was a submarine and that there were possibly people still alive on it. And so rescue was delayed for about 15 hours, and at that point there was no sign of life on the submarine anymore. So only 10 of the 36 men in the submarine escaped, and of those 7 died in the cold water. It went to court, and both vessels were found to be at fault, the City of Rome for not slowing down and not signaling her change of direction, and the S-51 for having improper lights. The U.S. Navy decided to argue that U.S. naval vessels were exempt from having to have proper lights because they were special, to which the court responded that submarines should then, quote, confine their operation to waters not being traversed by other ships. So the Navy had been having a bad press run, and this tragedy was not good for naval morale, so they decided that they would raise the submarine so that the individuals who had died on it could be buried. So it was down in about 132 feet of water. This is the 1920s, and the Navy at this point did have a vessel with a compression chamber on it so that naval divers could do the deep diving. that needed to be done. And divers worked for months to fasten pontoons onto the submarine. And they were able to raise the submarine and attach to the pontoons, and they towed it to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, arriving on the 4th of July in 1926, with the flags flying at half-mast. Onward to another submarine story. This is one that you all are probably familiar with. This is our German U-boat, which technically is outside of Rhode Island waters, but we count it as our submarine. So on May 4th, 1945, all the German U-boats were ordered to cease hostilities. The U-853 either didn't get the message or chose to ignore it, and torpedoed the steamer Black Point off Narragansett on May 5th. And so immediately after that, 3 naval vessels and 1 Coast Guard frigate set off to pursue and hunt down this rogue German submarine. You might not know how to hunt a submarine, but what you do is you drop depth charges that explode on contact with the submarine, and so when you see the explosions, you know that your depth charges have hit the target. And then, in this case, you were able to see the sheen of oil on the water, and they also found a German officer's cap floating on the water, so they knew that they had made their kill successfully. And the crew of the Coast Guard ship that was credited got to paint their little trophy of a U-boat on their own vessel, which was nice for them. The U-boat is still visited by many divers today, even though it's deep and dangerous, and it's actually still German property, and so should be left alone, but that doesn't stop people from bringing up souvenirs. And apparently there's one person in Tiverton that's trying to reassemble one of the torpedoes in his garage. So that's not safety conscious. Oh, well, I'm talking about safety conscious and things that explode. If you ever find a cannonball or a hand grenade underwater, and they are there, and they are and old depth charges, remember that black powder, the moment it dries out again, is just as explosive as the day that it was made. So your cannonball with black powder in it that seems wet and harmless at first will soon become lethal again, so safety. This is a side-scan sonar image of what the U-boat looks like today, and you can see it's pretty intact. Side-scan sonar sends the sonar waves sideways, and so you see the shadow of what they hit. And so you can see that it's very much the shape of a submarine. And recently, NOAA has been partnering with underwater folks at URI to get high-quality sonar images of some of our other submarines. This is the U.S. Bass. It was a V-2 submarine designed by Electric Boat, launched in 1924. Sadly, the Bass was something of a failure. It failed both the seaworthiness test and the speed test, and so she was decommissioned in 1937. When World War II happened, they brought her back into service, probably reluctantly, given that she was a failure, but tragically, in 1942, a fire ripped through her, killing 26 of her crew, and the Navy ended up using her as a target to test a top-secret acoustic homing torpedo in 1945. And the torpedo worked and cut the Bass in half. So she was a success as a target, so it was a happy ending, I guess. Here is another ship that is cut in half, this one from hitting rocks, not from an acoustic homing device. The Navy did not take this one down. This is the Belleville. It was a Norwegian freighter that went aground just west of Seal Rock and Newport at about 5:30 in the morning on September 24th, 1957. Okay, again, 5:30 in the morning in September, maybe there was some fog, although apparently visibility was pretty excellent. The captain blamed the pilot, who apparently mistook Beavertail Light for the Brenton Reef Lightship, which, I feel that even though I'm not a trained pilot, I could probably tell a lighthouse from a lightship in good visibility, but he didn't. And because the pilot had such faith in himself, the ship's radar, radio, directional finder, and depth recorder were all turned off, and the captain wasn't paying any attention. The pilot was suspended for 6 months, and the poor Bellevue was in 2 pieces. And that was a real spectacle. Lots and lots of people flocked to see that one. That is a shipwreck. That's the sort of shipwreck you remember your whole life. And unfortunately, the people of Jamestown remembered this one their whole lives, too. This is a less spectacular shipwreck. It's just your basic large vessel on the rocks. But unfortunately, this large vessel was carrying oil. And the rocks tore through her hull. It was 1962. By midday, she'd lost 28,000 barrels of oil and was still leaking. And approximately 339 gallons of bunker oil escaped from her by the time they were able to get her off and stop the flow of oil. It was a disaster for Jamestown. All the beaches of Jamestown were covered with the thick, heavy oil. The Sinclair Refining Company, who operated the tanker, was forced by the courts to make payments toward the environmental cleanup. And this was the first time that such a penalty had been demanded for an environmental shipwreck disaster in Rhode Island. So it was historic on that count. But there's still lots of people in Jamestown alive today who remember how horrible that summer was with the oil all over everything. So we've seen, what's that? The consensus is yes. Yes. So we've seen ships burning and ships aground and ships sinking. And now we're going to look quickly at gales, which is another marine misfortune that happens to many ships. This is the Great Gale of 1815, which was almost certainly a hurricane, and that's downtown Providence. It was pretty much a disaster for Providence's shipping. And that's what Providence would look like in hurricanes today if we didn't have the hurricane barrier. And then we move forward to the hurricane of 1938, which is the first hurricane we have actual photographs of. During the hurricane of 1938, all 4 of the Jamestown ferry vessels were put out of commission. And the people of Jamestown had been hemming and hawing about building a bridge for years, and then they met 4 days after the hurricane and were, let's build a bridge. So that's why Jamestown has a bridge today, because of the hurricane. And it tossed watercraft all over the place too. This is a scene from Tiverton. And this is a shipwreck that had gone ashore before the hurricane. It had been sitting off the coast of South County for a couple years before the hurricane happened. It went ashore in December of 1933. This is one of my favorites. The captain mistook a street lamp for the lamp of a passing vessel. And I can see, lights all look the same, but in this case, clearly he steered toward the shore, toward the light on the shore. And even though thinking that, and if it had been a passing vessel, he should not have steered toward that, so bad captain. So the Granville-Bacon ended up being a non-event as a stranding. This crew of 6 were taken off. The vessel was a total loss. And for 5 years, it sat on its sandbar peacefully until the hurricane of 38 used it as a weapon. It was picked up by the storm, swept across the salt pond, and slammed into 3 cottages on the other side of the pond, destroying them. So this is the only shipwreck that took down 3 houses in its shipwreck years. So it's important for that. So these storms and strandings and everything left considerable traces on Rhode Island's shores that the Victorians liked to be photographed with. They found them romantic. So there's about 20 people in the shipwreck, and the people at the back probably can't see them all, but there's people in every nook and cranny of this bit of rotten shipwreck, which must have stunk to high heaven and been slimy, and these people are wearing nice dresses and climbing around in it, and it's just, why? These people have found a much nicer shipwreck to be photographed in and appear to be having a better time. These are gay young people from the 1920s enjoying their shipwreck experience. Not everyone enjoyed derelict shipwrecks. This is a derelict shipwreck off a mansion in Newport in Brenton Cove. You know that one on the rocks opposite Fort Adams? That's what the bit of Brenton Cove looked like then. It had this derelict ship in it, a merchant vessel, the Bessie Rogers, that had just been towed there to rot. And so when the mansion was first being built, the new owner of the property did not appreciate the derelict vessels. He thought it lowered the tone. And so he offered it to the Navy to be used for torpedo practice. The Navy was developing torpedoes at that time, and they needed many vessels to use as practice. And in fact, the Providence Journal would rate the quality of the torpedo explosion. People would go down from Providence to watch boats be torpedoed, and the Providence Journal would say a fine explosion was had by all. But the Bessie Rogers, shown here, was too rotten to be a good target, and undeterred, they incorporated it into their dock and used it as a swimming pool, which is perhaps the worst choice of any of the people that I've talked about today, because can you imagine swimming in a rotting wooden vessel? No. It's just nasty. And there's still bits of the Bessie Rogers that you can see. If you're ever invited to a party at that house, go down to the dock and you can look in the water and see bits of the Bessie Rogers still there. So. And then some ships were creatively repurposed, like this one that was hauled inland to Coventry and became a bar until it burned. And there's many Coventry residents who have fond memories of it. Beer 10 cents. That's a good use for a derelict ship. One of the most well-known derelict vessels that you can actually see in Rhode Island is at the Charlestown Breachway. And every time there's a hurricane or a big storm, the same bits of ship get exposed. And I get calls saying, we found a shipwreck down in Charlestown. And I really appreciate when people call me to tell me about things. And so I say, oh, that's so interesting. But of course, I've seen it many, many times already. And we will never know what it is because there's so many generic wooden vessels that were repurposed as barges in their end years and ended up derelict on the shores. Like this one, for instance, which is holding together all that's left of what was once a 2-acre island in Occupus Cove in Warwick. The wooden vessel is essentially holding the sand together to make what's left of the island survive. And again, we will never know probably what particular vessel that was. It just symbolizes all of the wooden commercial vessels that once were so common in Narragansett Bay. You probably won't be able to see this in the back, but each of these darker spots is a derelict vessel. This is Green Jacket Shoals in East Providence, Rhode Island. And it was called Green Jacket Shoals because of the eelgrass that was growing there. It was very shallow. And so it was a shallow, out-of-the-way place next to a marine railway and dry dock. And so it was a very convenient place for ships to be salvaged and then dumped. There's about 33 abandoned shipwrecks sitting there rotting today. This picture was taken in the 1960s, and they're still mostly there. And some of them are fairly well-known Rhode Island vessels. The Mount Hope, for instance, was one of the most popular of the little excursion steamboats that went from Providence to Newport. And in the 1930s, it was taken to Green Jacket Shoals. Everything worth salvaging was salvaged. And the bottom picture is what she looks like today. And you can still see that at low tide if you go to the waterfront of East Providence. Green Jacket Shoals is, if you're going across the bridge and you see on your right the old pilings, the pilings are the dry dock. The lines of pilings are the old dry dock. And there's a modern barge that no one cares about and is an eyesore. And then there's these more historic vessels, late 19th century, early 20th century, between the modern barge and the dry dock pilings. And there's bits of miscellaneous wooden ship that come onto the beach. And people walk up to them and are very curious, and they tell us about them, and we're like, yep, sure is a bit of old wooden ship, which is really about all you can say about them. And so I'm going to end with a safety tip. Try to stay away from the lighthouses. Right there is a ship that did not stay away from the lighthouse. And if you want to find a shipwreck in Rhode Island, do look around the lighthouses. It's like basically looking for, you find the dead birds, by the big window. That's essentially what the lighthouses are. So, and so those are just a few of the stories of maritime misfortune that I gathered together in my book. And if you're interested in more, I do have a few more copies left for sale. And are there any questions? Yes.
So I love the cover of the book as well, especially for the shop in the background named Lucifer. I noticed that. But I'm curious as to why you settled on or chose this picture for the cover. What's important?
Repeat the questions, please.
The question was, why this particular maritime misfortune for the cover? And part of it was a design issue. It makes a nice cover because of the way the vessel's lying in its collapsed position. But also, I struggled to get my 180 pictures that I needed. It was really hard to find pictures, and it was hard to find pictures that had stories. This was a good picture, but I could not find out a single thing about the boat pictured there. And so I couldn't include it in the body of the book because I had nothing to say about it. So I was very happy to be able to use it for the cover. So if anyone recognizes it or comes across it, do let me know. Yes?
Do you do any research into the captains or crew who were, at the helm when these disasters happened? What happened to them?
So the question was I able to do much research into the captains and the crew and the people that were actually affected by the shipwrecks? And that was outside the scope of this particular book. Each maritime misfortune has its own interesting cast of characters, but it would require a lot of archival work to find out the details about them, and I just didn't have time for this project. But, yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
You mentioned a Block Island shipwreck that perhaps the islanders had brought it into the shore by lighting the light somewhere. It wasn't the Southeast Light. And those kind of rumors have been around for years. Do you have any sense as to whether they really did that?
Certainly, the question was whether there actually were wreckers on Block Island that lured ships to their doom. And certainly people took advantage of ships that wrecked. There were some coal barges that went ashore off Narragansett, for instance, in the 19th century, and the people of Narragansett were really warm that winter. And there's also what I like to think of as the great mackerel tide of Jamestown, in which a boat full of mackerel unloaded its cargo on the beach, and everyone went and gathered all the mackerel and ate well for several months. But there's no evidence that anyone ever did that deliberately in Rhode Island, although it was done deliberately in other parts of the world. So,
it's the Palatine.
yes, that's a romantic. The Palatine Light, for instance, that was a ship that Longfellow cast as the victim of wreckers on Block Island, but it wasn't true. It was a romanticized story. Any other questions? Yeah?
The Endeavor, was that still considered the property of Australia or the United States?
The Endeavor was not a naval vessel. It was a vessel that was being used by the British Navy, so it was not a ship of war that sank during war. So it was essentially private property being leased by the British Navy. And so when the Rhode Island government, realized that we had this important shipwreck, with the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project, who had been the ones that found this chain of evidence showing it was there, we decided that we would file a claim to the whole fleet of transports under salvage and admiralty law, so that we, the state of Rhode Island, would be the clear owner, and we wouldn't have to worry about wreck raiders coming in and absconding with the shipwreck. So the state of Rhode Island currently is the owner of the vessel against all comers. Often there are comers. If we hadn't done that, probably sport divers would have gone looking for it and pawed through it all and destroyed the evidence that maybe could prove which one was the Endeavor or not, and they would have taken the cannons. People still are taking cannons off shipwrecks, and this is sort of a digression, I know it's cold in here, but there was an 18th century shipwreck off Newport, the Minerva, that had a couple of cannons on it. And just 5 or so years ago, someone took one of the cannons off of it. And then once they had done it and taken it to their yard, they realized they didn't really want a cannon. So they left it like an orphan baby at the door of Fort Adams, because forts and cannons. And Fort Adams doesn't really want, random cannon from 18th century shipwrecks, because that has nothing to do with them, but it's still there. And if you go to the Fort Adams Visitor Center, look to the right, and you'll see a random cannon lying there, and that's from the Minerva.
Information about the cannon that they want to take to Australia from the Endeavor.
And just another quick cannon story. The Endeavor, the site that we think is the Endeavor, does have 2 cannons on it, and it was not a ship of war, so these were probably not fighting cannons. Often old cannons that were obsolete were thrown down into the ballast to be used as ballast. So that's why we have a Portuguese cannon from a land site in Charlestown. It was probably ballast, but that's another story. Anyway, the Australian National Maritime Museum has been supporting the work of the Rhode Island Marine Archaeology Project on the Archaeology, and they're very interested in taking one of the cannons back to Australia with them as part of the celebration of the anniversary of Captain Cook's discovery of Australia. So, okay, just do we have time for more questions, or? Okay. I'll look at the question there first. Yeah?
One morbid question. Were there any efforts to recover any human remains from the fatal shipwrecks and return them home?
The question was, human remains recovered from shipwrecks. Most of the human remains were not entombed in the shipwrecks. The submariners from the submarine incident that submarine was raised. The others, the people in the cabin of the passenger ship, the people in the Larchmont, there are probably dead bodies still on the Larchmont site, although it's fallen in on itself and probably marine scavengers were active. The Larchmont is known to sport divers, and I'm not sure how much it's been disturbed. There's a concrete ship in the East Passage, the Cape Fear, and they built a giant vessel out of concrete to see if that would work. And it floated really well, but the problem with the concrete vessel is you hit it and it goes crack. And so the Cape Fear went crack in the middle of the West Passage, and it sank immediately. And so there's people down, 150 feet in the, East Passage on the Cape Fear. So, and there's people on the U-boat too. They're still down there. Okay, yes?
August 7th, 1958, 2 ships collided off Rhode Island, the Gulf oil and
Yep.
grain. And there was a loss of life of 18 sailors from the Gulf oil. And it was that, I remember that from open.
This was another loss of life shipwrecks. 2 ships collided off Fort Adams, and there was a terrible fire and loss of life. And I have some good pictures of that actually in the book. So, yeah. Okay. One more question. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, if I decide with my buddies here and the birthday boy Dave Pelkey to go and recover one of these cannons, what do they actually weigh? Like how big a?
Okay. First of all, you'd be breaking the law. Yeah. Okay.
Besides that, because there's wrong.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So you really want a cannon?
Yeah. In my front yard.
You could go to the Fort Adams and break into Fort Adams and take that one.
But I want to recover it myself. What do they
All right.
weigh?
Well, of course, when they're in the water, they weigh a lot less than when they're in the land, so getting it to the surface is not really the problem.
Of course, we'll
The
feel
problem-
stronger when it's in the water. Now it's above. Now what?
Also, not to be difficult, but your cannons come from your small swivel gun size to your massive cannons.
I want a massive one. Come in. What's the way?
I'm sorry, I don't know. Tons.
Tons.
We'll go with
We
tons.
need a bigger truck. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, last question.
You talk of cannons.
I do.
Being able to figure out what a boat is from a cannon.
Yes.
There are cases where they talk about bells, names of boats on the bell.
Yes.
Hear that mentioned at all.
No, that's because the boats that we found with bells were ones that we already knew what they were. And so we've never had to rely on a bell with a name on it to identify the ship. And the bells were one of the things that was most commonly salvaged too. So if the bell could be salvaged, it was salvaged. So I don't have any good pictures of bells. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming.